Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. My name is Fawzia Mohammed, and I'm one of the lecture conveners for this year's Errol Solomon Meyers Memorial Lecture. I would like to commence the proceedings for this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Queensland is situated, the Turrbal Yagara people. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be here today. Dr. Nicholas Coatsworth, our guest speaker this evening, representatives from the University of Queensland Senate and Senior Executive, Mr. Doug Meyers, Mr. Richard Meyers, and representatives from the Meyers family who have supported our lecture for many years and who have taken the time to join us again this evening. Professor John Pern, UQMS Patron, Professor Nick Fisk, Executive Dean, Faculty of Health Science, UQ. Our event sponsors for this evening, Greenslopes Private Hospital, UQMS Platinum sponsors, Investec, Welsh's, and Avant. Other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening, where we gather to honour the memory of Professor E.S. Meyers, one of the founding fathers of our medical school at the University of Queensland. The establishment of the University of Queensland Medical Faculty in 1936 occurred after many years of advocacy. One of our acknowledged founding fathers was Errol Solomon Meyers, a pioneer of professional health education in Queensland. Professor Meyers, or Joe, as he was affectionately known, was born in Brisbane but undertook his medical training in New South Wales. Following his residency at Brisbane General Hospital, Professor Meyers enlisted in the Australian Army Medical Corps and served in France. In clinical practice, Professor Meyers was a senior visiting surgeon at the Brisbane General Hospital and the first surgeon in Queensland to pass a ureteric catheter and to carry out operations such as phrenic crush and thoracoplasty. He was active in the Queensland branch of the British Medical Association, being honorary secretary for 3 years, federal councillor for 6 years, and president in 1932. In that year, Professor Meyers delivered an address on the need for a medical school in Queensland, outlining the methods by which its establishment could be achieved. Education was clearly one of Professor Meyers' passions. Discussion around the need for a medical faculty in Queensland began as early as 1893, and from the mid-1920s, Professor Meyers advocated this case strongly. When the faculty was finally inaugurated in 1936, Professor Meyers was appointed lecturer in anatomy before becoming dean in 1941. His standing as a medical educator was such that he was one of only 2 Australians to be invited to speak at the inaugural World Conference on Medical Education in 1953. Despite all of these accolades, perhaps the best marker of Professor Meyers' success was his standing within the student body. Professor Meyers exhibited all of the qualities of an exceptional clinical teacher, including a passion for education and enthusiasm for learning. He was much loved, admired, and respected by the medical student body for his contribution to medical education. I would now like to invite Mr. Patrick Tunney to the stand.
Thank you, Fawzia. My name is Patrick Tunney, and I'm another of the conveners of tonight's lecture. The Errol Solomon Meyers Memorial Lecture was established by the University of Queensland Medical Society in 1957, the year following Professor Meyers' death. The purpose of the lecture was to honour his contribution to medicine, both as a surgeon and as a founding father of our medical school. The lecture is now in its 56th year, and our society has been honoured to host a diverse and noteworthy group of luminaries, including mountaineer and diplomat Sir Edmund Hillary, cricketer and humanitarian Imran Khan, the controversial British author Lord Geoffrey Archer, the late cardiac surgeon Dr. Victor Chang, and Nobel laureate Professor Peter Doherty. This year, we are privileged to have Dr. Nicholas Coatsworth as our keynote orator. He will be speaking on the theme of unexpected journeys from Darfur to Darwin. Dr. Coatsworth's career so far has been incredibly diverse, but has very much focused on humanitarianism. After graduating from the University of Western Sydney in 2001, he underwent an internship at the Royal Perth Hospital before moving to the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney. During his training as a physician, Dr. Coatsworth worked for Médecins Sans Frontières in Congo, Brazzaville, Chad, and Darfur. What began as a trip as a doctor soon turned into work as a field coordinator, and in 2010, Dr. Coatsworth was elected as the president of MSF Australia. Following re-election and another year as president in 2011, Nick now remains a director. Dr. Coatsworth went on to move to Darwin, where he now holds the position of Deputy Director of Disaster Preparedness and Response at the National Critical Care and Trauma Response Centre in Darwin. He's a consultant physician at the Royal Darwin Hospital in both infectious diseases and respiratory medicine. In this role, he regularly visits remote communities for specialist outreach. I would now like to invite Dr. Coatsworth to deliver the 56th annual Errol Solomon Meyers Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we gather today, the Turrbal Yagara people. I would also pay my respects to their elders past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be here today. Mr. Doug Meyers, Mr. Richard Meyers and representatives of the Meyers family, Professor John Pern, University of Queensland Medical School patron, Professor Nick Fisk, Executive Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, members of the University of Queensland Senate and senior executive, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. May I first take this opportunity to thank the conveners, Patrick and Fazia and Ona, for inviting me to deliver the S. Meyers oration this year. Having read through, and we've just heard the list of some of those individuals who've delivered this address over the past half century and more, I feel truly humbled. I did wonder as I read that list whether I was in fact deserving of such an honour. Rather than dwell on that, I realised that my task was to do justice to the spirit of this oration and of the man after which it was so named. When one is in mid-career, so to speak, one has to choose carefully upon the subject upon which to speak authoritatively. And I can tell you I thought long and hard on this point. And I've come to the conclusion that there is only one subject upon which I am truly the world expert, and that is myself. So if you'd indulge me this evening, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to walk with you through the story of my brief career as it stands so far. Share with you some of those journeys that I've been privileged to have and lessons that I've been fortunate enough to learn. So I had an argument with a very close friend of mine about this word career and what it meant. And it was a bit of an odd discussion because I'd always looked upon her career with a degree of envy, as something that I might aspire to. Yet she seemed to view medicine very differently. She had always been impressive, not in an aloof or a detached way. On the contrary, she was one of the more gregarious people in medical school. She actually left us after third year to become president of the University of Western Australia Student Guild. And the next time I looked, she was off in Boston doing a Masters of Public Health at Harvard Medical School. After a little time ferreting around the surgical subspecialties, including another stint doing ENT at Harvard, she settled on ophthalmology. Now, being a physician, I never really understood why smart people ended up doing ophthalmology. The eye being the window to the soul and everything, every ophthalmologist will tell you about the first time they diagnosed a systemic disease by looking at the retina. Sarcoidosis, vasculitis, tuberculosis. That never seemed to me to be the right path for clinicians, whom I thought would have been fantastic physicians, given their talent for communication and empathy. It's an odd coincidence, ladies and gentlemen, that three of my closest friends have become ophthalmologists. And I guess that's where the dispute over the word career arose. You see, my friend argued strongly that career, in relation to medicine, simply meant that the direction that your medical life took, a single path in a multitude of scientifically interesting pathways, supplemented by but divorced from other aspects of your life. In her case, politics, learning how to speak Tetun. I was romantically opposed to this view as opposed to romantically disposed to my friend, in that I felt medicine was a vocation, far more than a job, not necessarily all-consuming, but certainly visceral in that devotion to the patient. the pursuit and the acquisition of knowledge, the challenge of the uncertain diagnosis, and the life that a career as a doctor offers. For me, the word career was too sterile to define all the things that medicine represented. Career was something you could change, like shifting jobs mid-career. If not on a whim, then certainly with relative ease. But a vocation implied that you'd found the thing that you were good at and meant to be doing. As in many semantic arguments, and any argument had after race 8 at Flemington on Melbourne Cup Day, it actually soon became irrelevant. My friend is a wonderful... Oh, we've got sound back. I'll say that explains the gags falling a bit flat. My friend the ophthalmologist is a wonderful doctor, a consummate eye surgeon, and has an extraordinary capacity to take on new opportunities. I think one day she'll agree that she has found her vocation. For the purposes of this oration, however, I'm going to acquiesce to my friend and I'm going to talk about a career and where mine has gone. I went to medical school in the University of Western Australia. Everybody in medicine has a latent talent that's eventually snuffed out by the consumptive process of medical education, and mine was language and debating. So I was one of those 17-year-old school leavers, you know, the type that the graduate medical programs were supposed to weed out, that had to choose between putting medicine and law as number one in their preferences. Now, I've watched every series of Rake on ABC, and it's still true that I question my decision. My debating coach several years later, and I guess with some degree of perspicacity, would say, "It's good you did medicine, Nick. You would have been such an... if you'd been a lawyer." The next, Cleaver Green. There were a few brave souls who couldn't give up their other talents, and they actually dropped out. The concert pianist in the first year, the interior designer in the second year. I watched them, and I wondered whether they could have married their talents with a medical career, much like the string quartet we saw outside today, or whether my decision to continue was in fact the right one. It'd be unusual, I think, to go throughout medical school without contemplating dropping out at least once a year. For me, the motivation to continue was actually a desire to work for the organisation Médecins Sans Frontières. I actually thought that this would be the ultimate justification for what I was calling the missing years of my life that medical training took away. And perhaps this is a little too dramatic an imputation, but when you start at 17 and finish at 23 and then keep going, you certainly feel as though you've made a commitment. But the first few years of the career were devoted to making myself a suitable candidate for MSF. And that meant a selection of rural placements. Kicking off with a medical and ED intern placement at the Kalgoorlie Hospital. And I remember very clearly the head nurse in the emergency department, "Doctor, would you like to put some local anaesthetic in the eye before you try and remove that foreign body?" Never a career of ophthalmology. And I continued in emergency department at Port Macquarie Hospital in Taree. By pure luck rather than good management, I missed the cases of severe multi-trauma from the Pacific Highway or the very sick paediatric cases. In fact, I considered thrombolysis the limits of my thrill-seeking behaviour. With time, though, in those postgraduate years, it became less about Médecins Sans Frontières and more about which direction I would take amongst those multitude of different opportunities. Paediatrics was an attractive option, but it actually died a quick death when I missed a cannula on a 2-year-old and got yelled at by parents. My surgical consultant offered hope of a cutting career. "Nick, you seem to be the sort of guy that doesn't need to go home at 5 p.m. Way off the mark, Mr. Levitt. But the deed was done after my second term at Royal Perth Hospital with Dr. Arthur Harris. Arthur is a wonderful physician and endocrinologist and a true gentleman. I didn't ever see him go through a door before someone else, whether that be a medical student, a patient, or a hospital cleaner. He had a gentle manner. He rarely felt the need to engage in the professional jousting that we so often see at the expense of the patient, and he left ego out of his daily practice. You know, I read a passage recently that reminded me very much of Arthur, and it went something like this. "It is clear that he had little interest in money, material goods, and self-advancement, but great moral courage, and would pursue a matter of principle no matter what the personal cost. Many of his contemporaries, especially some in official places, could not grasp that a person could act for a reason that did not involve self-interest. His work was direct, practical, yet never losing the long view, the ideal. He might have been more famous, and certainly have been more wealthy if he had lived more selfishly, He chose to devote himself to a cause and found reward in seeing it prosper. Now, some of you, ladies and gentlemen, may have heard or read that passage before, and it would not surprise me if you could have heard it at this very lecture, for it was written by Mr. Derek Meyers about Professor E.S. Meyers and a reflection on his career and the sort of person that E.S. Meyers was. And it reminded me very much of the sort of person that my mentor, Dr. Arthur Harris, also was. I'm not sure what sort of tennis player Errol Solomon Meyers was. Perhaps we can find out, but Arthur Harris was a good one, and he beat me at the age of 65, 6-love, at the end of term in his farm outside of Bustleton, where he actually retired to in 2005. Arthur showed me the skills that the qualities that all clinicians should aspire to, and gave me a standard that I continue to try to attain. And after that, really, I had something to look at beyond just a desire to work for MSF, and the reason that I'd done medicine started to become clearer. I was just in my third year of medical practice when I climbed those stairs to the office of Médecins Sans Frontières in Australia. And I was backing my high school French skills around about a decade after last speaking a word of French. The interviewer asked if I spoke French. I said, oui. She asked in French what I'd had for breakfast. I said, un croissant, not knowing the translation for Weet-Bix. A lesson for young players, ladies and gentlemen. Medicine, but particularly humanitarian medicine, is no place to overstate one's abilities. So in the short space of a fortnight, I found myself accepting my first mission to the French Congo, or Congo-Brazzaville, in a small village far to the north of the country called Betou. Speak French. You have to speak French. They think you're a French speaker, was something along the lines of what they said to me before I stepped on the flight to Paris. So you get the picture. Like most non-native speakers of a language, I'm actually better at reading and writing than speaking and listening. So I was pretty confident that I understood the briefing pack about Congo-Brazzaville, civil war in the early 2000s, a devastated but rebuilding capital, a measles epidemic in the far north of the country, which was the reason why MSF was there. All except one word that I didn't recognise, pirogue. Pirogue wasn't in the dictionary. From what I could tell, I would go from Paris to Brazzaville, get a local flight to Mfondo, and then travel by pirogue to Betou. Now, Betou on the map is a long, long way from Mfondo. In fact, if you close your eyes and stick your finger in the middle of Africa, chances are that you're on Betou. I was hoping pirogue was local slang for a single-engined Cessna. And it will surprise none of you to learn that I was wrong. A pirogue is a canoe. So, some 72 hours after leaving Sydney, whirlwind briefings in Paris, Brazzaville, entering this completely unfamiliar context, I find that the Betou mission was in fact a 12-hour journey up the Ubongi River, which is one of the tributaries of the mighty Congo River system. Language, in particular the ability to speak one's own native language, is something that we take for granted in this country. But practicing medicine in a foreign tongue, unaware of the subtleties or the colloquialisms, let alone the medical terms, was as challenging thing as I think I'll ever have to do. Let me take you forward a few months from that departure as I write a transfer letter for a young child with glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency. Try translating that into French. Accompanied by 2 volumes of Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, also in French. The sort of nightmare that you might have the night before your physician's exam. It took me 3 days to write that letter. And then let me take you a few months further. 1 a.m. in Chad after vaccinating in 45-degree heat, exhausted after 7 months in the field, and having to defend myself against an accusation of racism levelled against me by the local health ministry, and managing to do so in French. I had spent hours in the Congo at the end of the hard days, literally by torchlight in a mud brick thatched roofed house, compensating for the time that I should have spent at school learning verbs. I became, after a fashion, a French speaker. And when I landed up in Chad, I confused the team there completely. Who was this fellow speaking French, claiming to be an Australian, but with a thick Congolese accent? Rick Ridgway, a modern-day American explorer, in recounting his journey across East Africa in a book called In the Shadow of Kilimanjaro, he writes the following passage. As I think back to some of my adventures, the ones that are most memorable are those that held surprises, that brought experiences that were not anticipated or revealed lessons that in advance were not considered. These are the true kinds of travel. The journey where the signposts are unfamiliar and where the new worlds you see reveal elements in yourself that you never knew existed. This was the unintended consequence to all of this, that I only became of, the unexpected lesson that I only became aware of after I'd returned from the Congo and Chad, how much of a better listener I'd become. I had to hang off every word, extract the syllables one by one, all effort focused on one thing, understanding what the patients were trying to tell me. When we practice in our native tongue, whatever it may be, our mind wanders to the next patient, the next discharge summary, the next clinic, or even to home. And it's a paradox that I've not quite got my mind around, but I'm certain it's real. A New York Times health blogger, Dr. Pauline Chen, reported a recent Hopkins study that quantified the time that residents were spending at various tasks. And for a given patient, only 8 minutes or 12% of the time for that patient care time was actually spent talking to the patient. I shared that piece with some Australian medical students on Twitter. And yes, I'm aware of the irony of talking about communication and Twitter in the same sentence. Their reaction indicated that they spent more time with their patients than Americans. But looking at my own practice and the residents and the registrars, and indeed what I do myself, I do wonder if we're spending enough time in direct conversation, not on a ward round where you're almost an intermediary, but sitting down in direct conversation with patients, listening to them, understanding them. As many of you are aware, one of the great joys and privileges of medicine that we canonise in the ethics of confidentiality is to share a patient's story with them. And in it often lies the diagnosis, and if not the diagnosis, then certainly a way forward in treating them. It's actually finding time to get to that story amidst all of the other secondary tasks of being a doctor that presents us with a bit of a problem. I've digressed a bit, so I'll come back to the humanitarian work. And I don't want to glorify any motivation behind why people go and do overseas aid work. I, like many others, was doing this partly because of adventure. Shortly, I would get that jolt of reality when I realised the enormity of the health needs at hand. But can you imagine that moment as I saw the pirogue setting off in the dawn light up the most immense river I'd ever seen, and glassy reflection of a sultry, sweaty tropical forest with mist covering the canopy there. This was exhilarating. It was impossible for me at the time not to draw some sort of connection to Joseph Conrad's most famous character, Marlowe. And for those who haven't read Heart of Darkness, please forgive me for a moment. But arriving at that camp around midnight, after a 12-hour trip up the river, welcomed by a short, animated little Peruvian guy working for MSF who was the project coordinator. This was actually a caricature of the Harlequin welcoming Marlowe to the inner station in the middle of the Congo. And then the next day, I met a young, pale, spectacled Belgian doctor who had this permanent line of sweat on his brow, had the air of someone who had done his time and perhaps been driven slightly mad by it. And very much like Kurtz, he had befriended and eventually married a Congolese midwife. Now, I hope this doesn't sound like a fatuous comparison. There was a more serious side to it, of course. Heart of Darkness is a novel fundamentally about a clash of cultures, a dominant culture and an indigenous culture in the middle of Africa. And I read the book again on returning home. It struck me that things had changed very little. In Betu in 2004, just as the Belgians had plundered the Congo for rubber 100 years prior, an Italian logging company was steadily gnawing through the virgin forest there. We could actually see over the river from Congo-Brazzaville, where we were, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, as you know, to the present day, is having its fabric torn apart by violence over its resources and its future shaped by powerful nations far beyond its own borders. It sounds very familiar to what was being written in the early 1900s. The history of that region around the Great Lakes and Central Africa, when you read it, is actually decades growing into centuries of tragedy. So for a young but relatively well-travelled Australian, this was actually a shattering reality that it seemed we had made so little progress from the world that the Conrad had described so well over 100 years prior. So Médecins Sans Frontières had been in this place since the early 2000s, when 30,000 refugees crossed the river from the DRC in their pirogues. And the reason they crossed the river was because the forces of Jean-Pierre Bemba were coming down from the Central African Republic trying to take the capital of the DRC, Kinshasa. And they were eventually repelled. And as many of you know, Jean-Pierre Bemba has been tried and convicted of war crimes by the International Criminal Court. But at that stage in 2004, the war had actually migrated across to the other side of the country, to the Great Lakes. Betu was peaceful, and MSF was actually closing this mission after 7 years. So you can imagine the mixed feelings that I have as I'm coming to this place. In my mind, I have notions of mile-long queues waiting to see a doctor under a tree. But what I found was a very well-established hospital, local staff of around 80 people who we were employing, and a couple of very nice operating theatres that rivaled anything that could be found in the capital of Brazzaville. The war wounded had long gone, and the surgeons were actually doing hernia repairs, which is basically a good indicator for an MSF mission that it needs to close. I would actually be the last doctor there, and it struck me very quickly that I was the downsizer. I was the closer, the sort of Bain Consulting of MSF, Mitt Romney in an MSF uniform, coming to close this place down. But the difficult thing, of course, was that the clinical work was still there. And MSF had made perhaps not a mistake because the need was there originally, but certainly this would be a little bit like, to use Queensland geography, setting up a very nice schmick hospital in Normanton or Corumba, and an NGO doing that, then expecting Queensland Health to take it over, which I understand in the current climate would not happen at all. But that's the sort of thing we were facing. So prior to us being there, there had been a doctor, a pharmacist and a nurse supplied by the government and working for a population of about 30,000. As we left, there was still a population of 30,000, but no one to hand over to. And to give you an idea of the clinical problems that were there, even something in a place of plenty, you can imagine this is a rainforest. There's no shortage of food. There's bushmeat, there's fish in the river, it's very easy to get food, and yet malnutrition was still an issue there. It was astonishing that we would see malnourished kids come in, but what would happen is the mothers would have another child very quickly after the first, so that neonate would be breastfed, and then the 2 or the 3-year-old would go hungry, and essentially to stop them from crying, the mothers would ground up this cassava-like material called manioc, which ended up being, it took about 24 hours to process this stuff, and you had to boil it and pound it and pestle it, and it stank when you were doing all that kind of stuff, so you knew when everybody was preparing manioc. But at the end, you got this stuff that was a little bit like an eraser that you might use in primary school, and we used to use it to dip in casseroles, and it was, considered local food. But the kids would get this to stop them crying, to fill their stomach, and it had a nutritional value of nothing at all. So in the middle of this place of plenty, we had kids with kwashiorkor or marasmus. And then you wondered, as Mitt Romney, the downsizer, we were actually instructed to close our malnutrition unit 3 months before we left, so we couldn't treat those children. As few as they were, we only had about 10 kids in at any one time. It was still a big thing to have to do. We also had 80 national staff that I mentioned we employed. Now, national staff are the backbone of Médecins Sans Frontières. You could take away the expats, but if you took away the national staff, you'd make a hole that could not be filled, and we owe most of our ability to work to national staff. But here were people who had been employed for 7 years of their lives in Betu, and we weren't handing over to anyone. When we handed over to the government, the government replaced us with exactly the same staff as they had before, which were a doctor, a pharmacist and a nurse. We also treated groups of people that didn't have any opportunity to gain healthcare anywhere else. Of course, it's a user-pay system there. But in that part of Central Africa, they're a culture that I'd never even encountered before or knew existed. But there is a tribe of pygmies who live in the north of the Congo and the Central African Republic, who operate via a barter system. And so without currency, they can't access healthcare at all. So MSF had been delivering healthcare where they had had none. And one of the most serious problems affecting the pygmy population was actually leprosy. As you know, very long-term, complicated treatment to try and get resolution of that. And so we were leaving these people with we were leaving a group of people with no jobs, we were leaving a significant proportion of the population with no healthcare. One of the other things we did as we left, which I've spoken about to some of you in the audience before, is we gave a payout to these 80 people who had worked for us, and according to French and probably Australian labour laws, they were paid pro rata for the service that they'd given. So there was one nurse, and it was in fact the only nurse who could speak English. His name was Jean. And so I had given him my MSF protocol books in English on the last night, and we had a bit of a party as we left. And we gave everybody their payout, and then in the morning we hopped in a pirogue and we left. During that morning, when we left, the Pygmies staged a protest at 5 o'clock in the morning, and the only two other aid workers there were two 6'4" Belgian guys working for the International Rescue Committee, and I can tell you that when they started crying, there was not a dry eye in the house. It was a very emotional leaving indeed. One of the problems we hadn't anticipated was that the Italian logging company that I had mentioned hadn't paid anyone. The government hadn't paid the police or the military, and yet we were injecting a whole heap of cash into the local economy, and it didn't take Blind Freddy to work out that everybody knew that our workers were carrying around wads of cash. So the night that we were in a pirogue on the way back down to Brazzaville after 6 months, Jean was shot and killed for his money by one of the local police officers, rushed to the hospital where there were only 3 people, and he died in the hospital. And I tell you that story not because it's grim, but to give you a sense of the reality behind aid work. I can tell you that I love MSF, and that's probably obvious to you, but we can't glorify humanitarianism. And to do good, we end up doing sometimes inevitable damage, and there's some things that we should consider that we don't. What's valuable about the organisation, or an organisation like MSF, and why I continue to work for them, is the constant grassroots reflection on what you do. Are we actually doing enough good? Do we adhere to the fundamentals of medical ethics? Can we truly say, first do no harm? To be part of MSF is actually to actively engage in those questions, and you can actually hold those who make decisions within the organisation to account. I returned to the field 3 years later in 2007 to the West Darfur region in Sudan, and I know for alliterative purposes more than anything else I called this talk From Darfur to Darwin. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Darfur, but this time I was project coordinator in a town called Zelinje, again swollen by a refugee influx, but this time it was 300,000, not 30,000, and they were internally displaced from the civil war in Darfur. There couldn't have actually been a starker contrast between what I'd seen or the nature of the mission of Betu and Chad. This was much more what I anticipated an MSF mission would be like. Security was very much an issue. Weekly assassinations were taking place. The government was trying to chop off the head of the rebel movement by killing the leaders within the refugee camps. And you would hear an assassination, multiple shots of an AK-47 was a party, and a single shot was someone getting killed. There was a curfew in place, and meetings with the local head of government, which we had to do as project coordinator, would actually end in a fit of apoplexy on his behalf, and inevitably an ejection of one of the NGOs from the region. Fortunately, at the time, we weren't one of them. Systematic rape was an ongoing issue, and kidnappings of the NGO staff. There were about 13 or 14 NGOs there, were a real and present danger. The climate was unforgiving, and relaxation was an impossibility. Certainly that was the toughest 18 weeks that I think I've ever been through. It's the character of the MSF volunteer to put themselves in situations that are unfamiliar and challenging. But it was in contrast with the less acute challenges of Congo and Chad. This was a time where I was very confident that I had reached my limits as an individual. I actually couldn't sleep. I started taking a few milligrams of Valium in the evenings to try and snatch a few hours of respite and unconscious rest. I felt incredibly lonely. The position of field coordinator is essentially above your team, but with your superiors in the capital or in Paris. And it's a very trying one. So you have the responsibility for the well-being of the team, for security analysis, for decisions of how to deliver medical care, interacting with other NGOs, the local population, the local government. We had instances of bombs going off when the Janjaweed weren't storing them properly, young infants with shrapnel wounds that we had to convince the government surgeons to operate on, and not the Janjaweed who was beyond salvage. Now, I can tell you that there are tougher missions with MSF. I think Darfur would have been a tougher mission a few years prior. Mogadishu, where the current president of MSF, Matt Cleary, was field coordinator, was certainly a tougher mission. And Angola, when my predecessor Rowan Gillies was there, could well have been tougher. But I can tell you that everyone has their set point beyond which one exceeds their own capacity to cope. So needless to say that around the 4-month mark, I was a bit of a wreck. I convinced myself that I had some sort of cardiac dysrhythmia, got myself medevaced back to the capital, Khartoum, and I actually ended up getting a Holter monitor and saw a cardiologist. And I left my team, and I left the project 2 weeks before what was supposed to be the end of my mission. So to this day, I consider that a failure. And I think it took me about 3 years, around about 2010, to come to terms with that. But even with all that behind me, after about 8 or 9 years with MSF and 2 years as president of the Australian chapter, I actually still feel very strongly that no matter what I've given to MSF, the organisation has given more back as a person, which is, I guess, is why I continue and keep trying to give to MSF. So I find myself in Darwin now, and I'm doing clinical work in infectious diseases and respiratory medicine, and I work at the mouthful that is the National Critical Care and Trauma Response Centre. And basically, to translate that, it's helping develop Australia's international disaster response capacity. I don't need to talk to you about Darwin. It's a fantastic place to visit. I've heard it said, seriously, that it's not really in Australia, just somewhere between Cairns and Jakarta, which I think is a very nice way to put it. It's a very, very eclectic place, Darwin, and sometimes the most Australian place in the country and sometimes the least Australian place in the country in terms of what you might think was quintessentially Australian. Working with Médecins Sans Frontières taught me that when a doctor wants to speak out or make a political statement, then you have to do it from the bedside of the patient or not at all. That's actually our position of strength as clinicians, and we're listened to when we make those sort of statements. If we exceed that mandate, our words can mean very little and we can be easily contradicted. And it's actually a fine balance, and we have that challenge a lot in Médecins Sans Frontières when we want to decide to speak out or not. It's a challenge that I'm going to try and navigate for you in conclusion this evening, by giving you my impressions about the state of healthcare of our Australian Indigenous peoples. And in doing so, I'm going to actually commit 2 sins. The first is to speak of the Northern Territory through the prism of a newcomer. I'm a southerner, and growing up in Western Australia, believe me, I understand parochialism very well. But this actually takes on a bit of a new meaning in the Territory, where there is a bit of a sense that thoughts or opinions can be dismissed. You need to have done your time there. And similarly, as we sometimes hear, speaking about Indigenous health either as through the prism of someone who is a relative newcomer could also be interpreted as a faux pas. I'm about to do both, and I apologise for neither. When I left for my work overseas with MSF, a close friend of mine was working in Alice Springs. This was for the first mission in the Congo. And she asked openly why I would leave and help others overseas when our own people were in need of the same help. And I must admit, I did not believe her. Surely comparisons to Congo and Darfur weren't real, given the situations over there. Now, I actually don't think that talking about third world conditions in our remote Indigenous community is terribly helpful. Mainly because I think it immediately puts up a barrier between what we have in urban Australia and the situation in our remote Aboriginal communities. It's an artificial barrier. If you talk about it being the third world, then it's not really our problem. It's very much our country and our problem. Indeed, somewhere between Cairns and Jakarta, not really in Australia. But can I tell you, regardless of those comparisons to the third world, that in the past 9 months working in the Territory, I have seen some of the sickest people thus far in my career in medicine. I've met artists, I've met community leaders, matriarchs of communities, and like the great Australian Dr. Yunupingu, they're succumbing young to chronic disease, bronchiectasis, renal failure, stroke, heart disease. And you know the statistic about closing the gap and the double-decade distance in life expectancy between for our own Indigenous people. But I think that statistic takes on a whole new degree of meaning when you start to have to see it with your own eyes, and you have to try and start to fix what may, in terms of those chronic diseases, not be terribly fixable in the short term. Unlike the diseases that I saw and the conditions I saw in the Congo, Chad and Darfur, what I'm seeing in the territory are medical conditions of the most pernicious and insidious type, with their origins not predominantly in poverty, but in education, lifestyle, unemployment and marginalisation. One of the things I got asked when I returned from overseas frequently, often at these sort of talks, people ask, having travelled as you do you think Australia has a racism problem? And I tell them this story. 2 years after I came back from the trip to Congo-Brazzaville, I was reading a French language newspaper. And there was an article about a Pan-African music festival that was held in Brazzaville. So cultures from all around Africa were concentrated in Brazzaville for this festival, including a group of pygmies from the far north of Congo-Brazzaville where we were practicing. They were invited to come and offer their music to this cultural festival. Now, all the participants were housed in public buildings, as you might expect, you know, convents or churches or police stations or army barracks. And I just wonder if any of you can think about where someone decided to house the pygmies. And that was the zoo, because people thought that they would be more comfortable there in their own environment, so to speak. And it wasn't until this article came out 2 days later that somebody realised what a problem that was and actually accommodated them in an appropriate environment. I saw, and I think you inevitably do, a great deal of racism overseas. Black and white, black and not so black, and in fact tall and short when it came to the pygmies. I even felt a victim of it myself a few times, which is very different coming from a place where you grow up in the dominant culture. But I didn't see anything quite as stark as that example of the pygmies, very possibly people I had treated being caged in a zoo. So my answer to that question, does Australia have a racism problem? I say no more than others. What we do poorly, I think, as a nation, though, is recognise instances of racism or acknowledge that they might permeate our institutions. It is such a loaded word and such a sharp accusation that I actually spent a lot of time thinking whether I was even going to stick it in this speech, to be honest. And sometimes I wonder whether we'd rather ignore it than confront it head on and admit that it may continue to be an issue that affects the health status of a significant proportion of our population. Now, I heard a story today that I would like to juxtapose against those statements. And that story was from none other than Professor John Pern. And that was one of his experiences in 1969 when he was the only doctor in Katherine Hospital. And an Indigenous gentleman who we would call, I believe in Arnhem Land they call today a countryman, someone who continues his own lifestyle, his own traditional way of life outside the communities, came into John in a very sort of in extremis, with severe anaemia and a haemoglobin that would have been about 18. And probably because of an advanced malignancy. Now, as was the case at the time, there were a group of people who had offered to donate blood and their blood type was available in a list, and so a cross-match could be done and some matching was available. And the person who had the adequate match to save this gentleman's life was actually the most prominent white fella in Katherine at the time, who was the meat packer, on whom, you know, a big gregarious fellow on whom the economy and the social fabric of the entire place was depending. And so John got in touch with this fellow and asked him to come in and donate his blood. And John painted that picture for me today of this white fella giving his blood into a citrated bag and then hanging it next to this dying black fella whose life was saved essentially. And that image actually contrasts with anything that I've just said, which are these stories of real grace that happen in Australia that make you think that no, actually, on an individual level, when it comes to one-on-one in our dealings with race relations, there are often a lot of very, very, very good things that happen as well. So you can see the complexity of those sort of problems. I also want to dwell on a criticism that I've heard a reasonable amount recently that's been levelled at both Indigenous and non-Indigenous patients, but mainly Indigenous patients in the hospital system. And I've heard these words, this person is not engaging with the health system, this person is not engaging with their own healthcare. I have difficulty, in fact I have no concept of what people mean by that essentially meaningless statement. It has to be our job as clinicians to help our patients navigate their illness and the health system. And many of you may have been consumers of healthcare yourselves in Australia. It's a dauntingly complex system. The interaction between primary care and hospital care, public and private, obtaining and following up investigations. Now, all the problems that we hear about of a non-integrated, non-patient focused health system are actually magnified 100-fold when it comes to treating patients, where the English language might actually be the third or fourth that they've learnt, as is the case of many people born and raised in Arnhem Land, for example. And having learnt and practiced medicine in a foreign tongue, I have an immense amount of empathy with how difficult that is. And when I see a patient from a remote community now answer yes to every question or statement, it actually reminds me of myself in 2004 during handover from Dr. Kurtz, when I just answered we to most things he said, actually having no idea what it really meant. There's no doubt that the hardest clinical work that I've done has been over the past 9 months trying to fit the square peg of Australia's health system through the round hole of the needs of our Indigenous patients. It's incredibly difficult to try and go that extra mile for every patient. And you need to, but the reality is you can't for every patient, and frequently you see the system winning. I have nothing but the greatest admiration and consider it a real privilege to be able to work alongside clinicians now who have worked in the top end for the bulk of their careers. And there are, of course, many more of our colleagues throughout Queensland and Western Australia and the southern states working in regional centres in Aboriginal medical services across the country. And so nearly a decade after first entering the world of MSF, I find myself needing to fall back and rely heavily on those lessons that I learned. In particular, how to re-engage with patients. How do you listen to their stories again? Having to pause and listen and wait beyond the yes. Read the body language behind the words. Take time to understand a new culture. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't pretend for 1 minute that the solution to closing the gap is simply by us all becoming better listeners. But as the famous author Richard Trudgeon points out, we ask our Indigenous patients to cross a cultural divide almost entirely on their own to meet us over here, rather than us taking some steps back. My solution then, through listening and understanding the difficulties that our Indigenous patients expose in the way we deliver healthcare to all, is to actually find new ways of practice that can benefit all Australians through improvements to the system. A friend of mine, Budima Lakuj, together with the former Young Australian of the Year, Sam Prince, run a program called One Disease at a Time and are looking at eradicating scabies in remote Indigenous communities. So I've got my own little project running. It's called One Patient at a Time, and I'm trying to change the way that I practice to try and bridge that gap from our side, and I'll let you know how it goes. May I conclude then in that very, very vein, with the message that it's not necessarily the grand acts on the great stage and the great policy decisions that make most of a difference in life. And the quote that I'm going to use is from George Eliot, which in a way pays tribute to many of the medical careers I've discussed, to Professor E.S. Meyers, to my friend the ophthalmologist, to Dr. Arthur Harris, to those who work for Médecins Sans Frontières, and for those who work in Indigenous healthcare in Australia. And it goes something like this. The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who have lived faithfully, a hidden life, and rest in unvisited tombs. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
We'd now like to call upon Professor John Pern to give the vote of thanks to Dr. Coatsworth.
Fazia and Patrick, our conveners, Dr. Claire Moore, our president and host of the UQMS, of course, our wonderful speaker and colleagues all. So many of us know that a degree in medicine is truly a passport to the world. And we've been privileged tonight to hear how, in the exercise of that passport, somebody working in Australia, in its many different environments, or in many other of the hotspots in the world, has to call upon such reserves of courage, of resilience, of endurance, of improvisation, and perhaps, as we've heard, most importantly of all, the retention of a sense of humour. All of us who work in these areas know that when one of us goes overseas to work, as we've heard tonight, in Africa or in the other many spots in the world where there is great need, we learn so much from our patients. And Dr. Coatsworth tonight has, in these stories and in the perspective that he's given us of both overseas and Australian service, has highlighted the centrality of the patient. And it's the one doctor and the one patient together, which is the very fundamental core of all our medical course, indeed of all our profession of the health sciences after we graduate. We know from our statistics that 1 in 8 of our graduates in medicine from the University of Queensland will serve in a troubled spot in the world within 10 years of graduation in a service role, either with Red Cross, in a non-combatant role with one of our 3 armed services, with a church mission, or with Medicine Sans Frontières. Many of us have looked out and enjoyed the adventure of that, as Nicholas has told us tonight. Many of us in the future, from our School of Medicine here, will go out and give such service. And Dr. Coatsworth, your address tonight, I know, will raise that statistic from 1 in 8 to even higher levels. We've been greatly privileged to hear your perspective tonight, and we join together in thanking you for your delivery.
We'd now like to invite any questions that you may have. We have roving microphones, so please stick your hand up.
Thank you very much for taking the question. So your work with MSF is obviously a very large part of who you are. I'm curious what you feel the biggest challenges are facing MSF today.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, because it's something that the organisation, as I said, it engages in a lot of self-reflection. And sometimes on the board we say to the point of navel-gazing, but I think if you're going to adapt, you have to occasionally do that as an organisation. So what's interesting about MSF is the challenges will vary depending on who you speak to. I think for me there are 2 major challenges. The first is, and they both relate to access to patients, but the first is that the context that MSF operated in, if you guys remember well, the pictures of the medical packs with the Red Cross on the back of donkeys going across the Khyber Pass into Afghanistan in the early 80s. The model works well within a failed state, and where the government is not so interested in whether you should have access or not to the people. It becomes very different. So contexts like Haiti, contexts like the Democratic Republic of Congo today, and more recently the new nation of South Sudan, access tends to be, by and large, more straightforward getting into the country. Thereafter, there are obviously issues. But other contexts like Sri Lanka, it's a lot more difficult because countries have support of other large nations behind them. And Syria is another very good example where once again you're getting a polarisation of the sort of world geopolitic there. And to try and actually get in as doctors and nurses and try and treat the patient there is a very difficult thing. And I can tell you the example from Sri Lanka because it's a really poignant one for us. MSF prides itself on being able to speak out from the patient's bedside when it sees lack of access to healthcare or some sort of compromise in their healthcare that's occurring because of the government. And we've spoken out in Rwanda, we've done it in Ethiopia and several other contexts. But in Sri Lanka, MSF had to sign a memorandum of understanding with the government to say that it would not speak out to try and guarantee access to the patients. And that sort of thing, I think, as other governments see that, is going to be a lot more common and a challenge to one of the fundamental principles of MSF. The second one actually relates to the delivery of healthcare. MSF's just subject to the same sort of problems or indeed debates. They're not necessarily problems as any other healthcare system, and that is hyper-specialisation and how you deal with chronic disease. Because, I think when you look at any global health organisation, chronic disease is starting to become a priority. It's no less of an issue for MSF. And how do you deal with that? Well, do you deal with a generalist, or do you try and get endocrinologists in, or cardiologists? And there's certainly movements in MSF, just as there are everywhere else. I give the example of the paediatricians who on some cases will genuinely want a paediatrician to be treating patients, but I think rather than a generalist. But I think we're managing to navigate a middle road where we have poles of expertise. So in fact, Australia's expertise is paediatrics and women's health, which will be interesting for you to know that we have a project unit in MSF in Sydney that specifically deals with those issues and then exports that knowledge to the generalists in the field. So I think they're the two biggest challenges from my perspective. Again, you'll get a different perspective from different people, but certainly MSF Australia, at least on the second one, is working hard to address it. Yeah. We'll just wait for the mic to come down.
Hi, Dr. Coatsworth. Thank you so much for taking the question and giving us this speech. I'm wondering, given your wide range of experience in MSF, do you think that there's a barrier for females to work in these rural areas? And if you do see some of your female colleagues having these barriers, how do you think that they might have overcome it? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for the question. I've seen female project coordinators work in some pretty trying circumstances. So I think the general rule is that it's certainly not an issue from MSF's point of view. We just had, you may be aware, 2 MSF workers, both female, who had been abducted in Somalia. Or in Kenya, sorry, at the Dadaab refugee camp, then taken to Somalia. They've recently been released only 3 days ago from a 21-month ordeal. There are certain risks that will be clear to you that a female has that males do not have, that people need to be aware of when they're going away. But in terms of the sort of contexts where gender becomes an issue, in the Pakistan floods, down the road from where the trauma centre was practising, there was an MSF mission, and the project coordinator there was female. The past president of MSF France, almost majority on the MSF International Council, I think it's certainly an organisation that there's no gender barrier to practising within, and the contexts, although when you look at them there would seem to be, I think in practice you find that the blokes and the girls get out there and they get into the situation, they just do the job. So I haven't seen too many examples of where it's been a barrier to actually working. But it's an excellent question.
Thank you very much. Was there someone else?
No, that's all right. Might get the other mic just down there so we can get ready for the next question.
Okay. So I'm called Grace, and I've been working in Uganda before I moved here. I'm just concerned, I guess, what you mentioned about when the programs have to close. It's something that is a challenge, I guess, obviously, in different African contexts where we have all these different NGO-funded things. When the funding stops, things have to close. That whole when things have to close.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, I guess with regard to MSF, if there is any way in which any form of capacity building on ground or some kind of gradual transition process or something, to kind of prevent the concept of doing harm, if there's been any change in that regard, because it is quite a challenge.
Absolutely. And every mission, there's constant debate. Some people, there's a philosophy that you can't open without an exit strategy, and there's a counter philosophy that if you adopted that philosophy, you'd never open anywhere. So there's that sort of argument within MSF. And it depends a lot in some ways on what sort of thing we're treating. So if you look at tuberculosis and HIV, for example, it would be completely naive to start that sort of mission and put patients on lifelong, at least 6 to 24 months of TB treatment or lifelong HIV treatment without some sort of plan to hand over. Now, with the specific reference to HIV, MSF's done a lot of work in working on decentralised programs. There's been even some challenges to the DOTS theory with tuberculosis. And so we have a philosophy of trialling new things that can then be adopted within health systems that might actually make things easier. We would always look for partners to hand over to, certainly in Myanmar and in the Yangon project in Myanmar. There's been a handover process for a number of TB and HIV patients. It gets less straightforward when you're talking about the generalist sort of projects, the malnutrition projects in Niger and that sort of thing, where there might not be a partner. But Niger is actually not a bad example. When you discuss capacity building, MSF got kicked out of Niger for a political faux pas. And actually the workers, the national staff, the doctors and nurses who've been working alongside MSF, then started up their own national NGO using the skills that they'd learned from MSF to deliver a malnutrition program in Niger. When we were in Zalinje, the guys who worked for us who had been there for a long time called MSF the University of NGOs because inevitably MSF was the first there, the first to start employing national staff, and that's where people cut their teeth in the NGO world. So I think it's a valid criticism to say that there's no formal capacity building, to my knowledge, but the informal capacity building that you get simply by employing a ratio in the Congo of 1 to 20 of expat to national staff is that you end up training a significant portion of people. The other thing I should say is I wasn't doing a great deal of the training in the Congo. You can imagine the national staff were training me. And part of the, you can go as residents. I think that maybe anticipates another question that might be coming. You can go as RMOs, but you're there to sort of watch the protocols being adhered to. You're certainly not in a position to impart a great deal of knowledge, although occasionally you'll see a type 2 diabetic and you'll feel more comfortable. There's a question down there.
You mentioned a couple of times that you think, I guess it's difficult to find the balance for where doctors should act as advocates. I guess my question is, on a more domestic or national scale, what do you think the role of doctors is in advocating on medical-related political issues?
Well, I think there's a strong role and a strong tradition in Australia, and I think certainly the Australian Medical Association in various points has taken up the cause for patients very strongly, and the way that you do that though is by making it clear that the patient is your focus and that you're speaking from your position of strength at the patient's bedside. What you don't want is for I guess there's a multitude of other groups out there who would claim to represent, who do represent patient interests, who are not doctors, consumer health groups, so on and so forth. And the challenge is for the medical profession to have their voice heard alongside that with equal weight. Now, I guess part of that issue may well be that when doctors see doctors representing, are they representing themselves or are they representing the patient? What's actually going on? And that might be more to do with clarity of communication and positions taken on various things rather than whether we should or shouldn't. So I think the answer is firmly that our peak representative bodies should. I think they do. And I think that, as I said at the AMA National Conference last year, if you advocate from the position by the patient, then that's the place that you'll be listened to the most. I'm conscious also that I have the former president of AMAQ and the new president of AMAQ in the audience. I hope that represents well enough what the situation at the moment in Australia.
Dr. Coatsworth, thank you so much for having us again. You mentioned earlier challenges working with governments, sort of political agendas governments may have. What do you think is the best way, or how does MSF deal with these challenges? How does MSF resist agendas or ulterior motives possibly from governments in countries you work in?
Well, it's a real challenge. Can you imagine when you go away with MSF or any NGO, you're sending doctors, nurses and logisticians, not bureaucrats, people from DFAT or diplomats. So this is very much a learnt skill in an organisation like MSF, and the only thing you can do is make sure that your delivery of healthcare is not being manipulated for an alternative agenda. And probably the best example and most concrete is Ethiopia in the famines in the 1980s, sort of heal the world sort of time, where the Ethiopian government was instructing all the NGOs to deliver aid in a particular place. So the people would come down to that particular place because that's where the aid was, and they were actually using the NGOs as leverage for mass population displacement and relocation of a certain subset of the population. Now, that was the point where MSF France decided to pull out of the country and speak out about it because they felt that they were breaking the principle that, of medical ethics that we adhere by as well, first do no harm. So I think if you analyse what's going on by that principle, then most of the time, you'll be on the right track. You may not always get it right. A recent book by MSF, Humanitarian Negotiations Revealed, I don't know whether it's just published internally, but it actually goes through about 10 or 11 different contexts from Ethiopia through to Sri Lanka, through to Sudan, through the DRC and Angola, where a different position had to be taken every time because the context on the ground was different. That's why you've got to keep the experienced people with the organisation. It's really difficult, and I think one of the things that we need to do, and if I had one thing that I need to do in my last year as a director, it's trying to encourage the colleges, in particular my own, the College of Physicians, to actually accredit time so that the more experienced clinicians can actually stick with the organisation, because you have to leave. I mean, I can't go to the field now, junior consultant, young family, that sort of thing. And in fact, the last mission was 2007. So you need to keep your experience there, because otherwise you're left with this very big hole in middle management, and that's bad news in places like Syria, where you really need the experienced people to be.
Dr. Coatsworth, throughout your career, you must have considered the paradigm between clinical work on the front lines, treating one patient at a time, contrasted with public health initiatives and organisations that, I guess, aim to work with local governments in creating political environments that are conducive to health in the long term. Do you feel that the MSF will remain in the first category of those organisations? And can you comment on the relationship that is necessary between the two?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, the short answer is yes. And I guess it's a bit of a cop-out in some ways, because MSF, it's a lot like being a hospital doctor. It's all about one-on-one with the patient, and what goes on outside in policy actually doesn't come into it too much. There are the way that MSF's chosen to marry it is actually have a relationship with a organisation called the Access Campaign to Essential Medicines. And MSF partially funds the Access Campaign, and the Access Campaign drives such things as the Novartis, a case against Novartis in India for trade-related aspects of international property rights. So basically keeping the Indian and Brazilian generics open, which MSF and the Access Campaign call the pharmacy of the world. That's the policy level that MSF is operating on. Again, because we want all the patients we treat to have Truvada-based HIV, tenofovir-based HIV therapies. And if you stop generic production or you extend patents, then you're not going to get that. So I guess, again, when you see a problem that's created in your practice, then there are mechanisms for an organisation like MSF to influence it. Can we do more? Sure, I think we can. Can we fund more? The decision is generally that our funding goes to what's happening on the ground at a specific time. And when you start getting into the arguments about funding more for the Access Campaign and the policy side of things, there's a very strong movement that says, no, we're the action guys, we're going to stick with that. Whether that's right or wrong or not, I think is up for debate.
Thanks.
Does that answer the question? You were sort of going back to the microphone.
Yeah, I think it does. But I guess one thought that's been on my mind is, do you ever get a sense of futility after leaving just war-torn regions when bad things are just going to continue to happen, and how do you deal with that feeling?
Yeah, I mean, you do, and I guess you quite rightly drew from the speech exactly that sort of sense after leaving the Congo. But then, as we went through and we got to the end and we started talking about, one disease at a time, one patient at a time, one brick at a time, that sort of thing. That's how you reconcile it. You're there to do you put a single act with your interaction with one patient, maybe you treat them with malaria, and that's part of the wall that actually ends up fixing the whole problem. It's a slightly romantic way of thinking about it, but it does compensate for that feeling of futility that you're referencing quite well. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, time for one more question, Patrick tells me.
You say one more question? Can I ask two questions?
Yes, you may.
Okay. All right.
Can I choose which one to answer?
Okay, I'll give them to you and then you can choose. Okay. So question number one is, what advice do you have to everyone sitting here as to what they need to do to work for MSF in a couple of years' time? The second question is, how do you merge life back home with your life working long-standing with MSF? So, your choice.
No, I'll answer both, because they're both excellent questions. The first question has a couple of parts. I have a lot of passion for MSF, and you see it in the speeches, but it's not the only aid organisation in the world, and there are organisations out there with different philosophies. And like the previous question, if that sort of sense that you're going in and out and you're not capacity building is not for you, then there's plenty of organisations that will do that And I think that the first thing you want to do is, if you do want to do that sort of work overseas, pick your organisation and talk to people who have been with them and decide what you want to do. The second thing is, sometimes it's a mistake to try and fit your CV to go on these sort of things. I think you got from the speech, you end up working through your career and making your career choices about where you want to go, and then you'll slide into one of these things if it's the right thing at the right time. I did an MPH, a Masters of International Public Health, and I enrolled in it the year prior, and I can tell you right now that I enrolled in it because it would look good on my CV for MSF. And although I got a lot out of that MIPH, I think I would have got a lot more out of it if I was doing it because I was just doing an MIPH. So I hope that gives you an example. Just make sure it's the right thing for you. And again, aid work, there are plenty of different things. Just try and find your area of interest, and go towards that would be my advice. The second thing is really difficult. I mean, I would have loved to go on another couple of missions for MSF. Yeah, I mean, I went to Congo and Chad, and I went to Darfur, and in a lot of ways people talk about being a director of MSF like the methadone program of MSF, in that you're getting, your cravings are being capped, but you're not really getting the hit that you need, that sort of thing. So, you try and be involved in that way, and it's a very different thing. You're a company director, you're not going to the field. It's got its own ups and downs. But at one point, and there's this bimodal peak of people who go to MSF. There's the people who are in their 20s who are 2 years out of their nursing or medical degrees, and they go for a few years, and then they have to come back for their careers. So you start around about the 30 to 40, you start dipping, and then around about the, got to be careful with my ages here, probably around about the 55, when the kids are starting to leave school, suddenly you see a stack of people back in the field. And there was a 70-year-old in Chad who was doing 12-hour days in 45-degree heat, and he was just powering through, a 70-year-old Frenchman. So you've got those two, and then you've got the people in the middle who stick with it and just do back-to-back missions for the rest of their life, and I wouldn't recommend it. It's probably not good for the soul. So I think you have to make a choice. You have to make a choice at some point in your career to say, I can't do that anymore. Maybe I'll be able to do it again in the future. I'm going to do different sorts of things. And that's how you get the balance, I think. Great. Thank you very much for those questions.
Dr. Nicholas Coatsworth, Mr. Doug Meyers, Mr. Richard Meyers, Professor John Pern, Professor Nick Fisk, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As it is my duty to deliver the vote of thanks, I would like to recognise the contributions of a number of people without whom this lecture could not have taken place. Firstly, I would like to thank the loyal sponsors of the UQMS who have contributed generously to this society over the years and are integral to the ongoing success of this lecture. These are our event sponsors, Greenslopes Private Hospital, and our UQMS Platinum sponsors, Investec, Walsh's and Avant. I would also like to formally acknowledge the contribution of the UQ School of Medicine and the UQ Vice-Chancellor's Office, who have generously supported this lecture for many years and have been fundamental to its continued success. It is with great pride that I extend thanks to Mr. Doug Meyers, Mr. Richard Meyers, and the extended Meyers family who are here with us tonight. Your continued engagement and support of this memorial lecture cannot be understated, and it is extremely valued by the UQ medical student community. On behalf of the entire UQMS, I would also like to sincerely thank and congratulate the conveners of the E.S. Meyers Memorial Lecture in 2013, Fawzia Mohammed, Patrick Tunney, and Ona Okon. These three individuals have been working as a team for over 18 months in preparation for tonight, and their dedication and professionalism is a testament to all that you have seen here this evening. Finally, on behalf of the University of Queensland Medical Society, I wish to extend the sincerest of thanks to Dr. Nicholas Coatsworth for delivering this memorial lecture. I am sure everyone in this room has taken something truly profound and inspiring away from what was presented tonight. Each year, the UQMS commissions and strikes the E.S. Meyers Medal to commemorate the contributions of this year's orator to the proud history of the E.S. Meyers Memorial Lecture. It is on behalf of the entire medical student community at UQ, and also with great pride, that I now present this medal to Dr. Nicholas Coatsworth in recognition of his delivery of the 56th Errol Solomon Meyers Memorial Lecture. To close this evening, I would like to thank all of you, fellow medical students, medical professionals, friends and family, and the wider community for your continued support of this memorial lecture. And I ask you to please join us for refreshments in the UQ Centre foyer.